We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 85b. On the previous summit, the Gemara was interpreting the line in the Mishnah which talks about an animal that is a carbanola that goes up on top of the Mizbeach alive. It's supposed to be brought down from the Mizbeach, but in this particular case, they actually slaughtered it on the top of the Mizbeach, and the Mishnah says that it needs hefshet v'nituach, it needs to be flayed and cut up at the top of the Mizbeach. And the Gemara, in interpreting this Mishnah, interpreted that we're talking about a situation where actually it had a shas hakosher, but then it became nifsala after, meaning to say it became nifsala, it became puzzle after the zrikas adam, after the blood was thrown. And so in such a situation, you do the hefshet v'nituach, you do flay and cut up the animal, and then the Brisa says you bring it down and you rinse it off. You rinse off the innards. And the Gemara asks, why should you rinse off the innards? Because in such a situation, the Gemara had said on the previous summit that you're actually just going to burn it, you're not actually going to offer it on the Mizbeach, so what's the point of rinsing those innards? And then the Gemara said on the previous summit, the point is that let's say a Kohen would find it, so then if he does go ahead and offer it, we don't want him to offer it with the dung, so that's why we rinse it. But the Gemara still asks, are we going to do something that's actually going to cause the stumbling block? If you rinse it, it's going to look like it belongs on the Mizbeach. That's going to cause this very stumbling block we're talking about, that the Kohen's going to go and offer it on the Mizbeach, and this was a disqualified carbon that is not supposed to be offered on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, nevertheless it should be rinsed. Adif, it's better to rinse it. We don't want Kodshe Shemayim to be sitting there like nevela with the dung, and that's why it should be rinsed. Rashi explains, V'anon neku lashon kushu. This is a question. We're going to go rinse it off, and then lidei takol, it's going to be a stumbling block. Lahalos psulin sheyerdu. You're going to end up offering disqualified items that were already brought down from the Mizbeach. And the Gemara then answered, Mutalim kenevela. We don't want them sitting there like nevela. Hakirvayim beperishalan, that the innards should be with the dung. That we do not want. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, Boy Rabbi Yochanan, the Rabbi Yochanan asked the following question, A murei kodshim kalim shehelon lefnei zrikas daman, if you have the sacrificial portions of kodshim kalim, of those karbonos of lesser kedusha, and you brought them up on the Mizbeach before the zrikas adam, it's the zrikas adam that really is supposed to permit them to be brought upon the Mizbeach. So in such a situation, when they were brought up before the zrikas adam, yerdu or lo yerdu, are they taken down from the Mizbeach or not? Amar le Rabbi Ami said to him, Tiboy lach me'ilah. You should ask about me'ilah, because again, this is talking lefnei zrikas daman. Really, it's after the zrika that there should be me'ilah, because then they belong, so to speak, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so you should ask about me'ilah. Amar le, he said back to him, me'ilah lo kami boili. It's not a question to me about me'ilah. The zrika hu dekaval hu b'me'ilah. We understand that zrika is what establishes that there is me'ilah here. It's lefnei zrika, so there is no me'ilah. The question to me is, Yerida, the question is again, should it be taken down from the Mizbeach? Upashit, and then he answered the question, Lo Yerdu, that it should not come down from the Mizbeach. Once it goes up on the Mizbeach, it stays on the Mizbeach. Ve'ein bahen me'ilah, but there is no me'ilah in such a situation. In other words, in such a situation, even though this is lifnei zrika, so it doesn't really, so to speak, belong to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and so there is no me'ilah yet at this stage, but nevertheless, if it is on the Mizbeach, it should not come down from the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, V'tiboy lach me'ilah, imahani lulik ve'inu b'me'ilah. You should ask whether it's established for me'ilah in this situation. And the Gemara then said, Lo yerdu, it doesn't come down from the Mizbeach. The nasu lachmo shal Mizbeach, it does become the bread, so to speak, of the Mizbeach. Umiu, but nevertheless, me'ilah lesbu, there is no me'ilah. The lo huvru l'chelek roy l'gavoa. It wasn't established, or it wasn't selected to go to the portion of the Almighty, and so therefore in this situation, there will not be me'ilah. And the Gemara continues, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Masni Hachi. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, he taught it as follows. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, the Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, Boy Rabbi Yochanan, the Rabbi Yochanan asked, Emurei kodshim kalim shehelon lefnei zrikas daman. Again, you have the sacrificial portions of kodshim kalim, they were brought up on the Mizbeach before the throwing of their blood. Yesh bahen me'ilah olo. The question was, is there me'ilah or not? Now that they were brought up on the Mizbeach, maybe we should say that there is me'ilah, even though there was no zrikas adam. Amar le Rabbi Ami said to him, according to this version, V'tiboy lach yerida, you should ask whether it comes down from the Mizbeach. Amar le said back to him, Yerida lo kami boili. It's not a question to me about coming down from the Mizbeach. The nasu lachmo shal Mizbeach, it certainly becomes the bread of the Mizbeach. It should not come down. Ki kami boili me'ilah. The question is me'ilah. Upashit hachi lo yerdu ve'ein bahen me'ilah. And he answered that they don't come down from the Mizbeach, but there is no me'ilah in this situation. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, V'elu lo haya psula. In the following cases, the disqualification was not in the Kodesh, and therefore, if they go up on the Mizbeach, they do come down from the Mizbeach. And then the Mishnah goes on to bring the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that when it comes to an animal that is blemished, if it goes on the Mizbeach, it does not come down from the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo hechsher Rabbi Akiva ela bedukan shaba'ayin. Rabbi Akiva, when he said an animal with a blemish stays on the Mizbeach, that's only when the blemish is a small blemish in the cornea of the eye. Ho'aluch sheirim ba'ofo. Since that kind of blemish is kosher when it comes to birds, therefore, again, in the situation of animals, it would stay on the Mizbeach. V'hu shekadam hekdeshan es muman. But that's only if the animal was first consecrated before it developed that blemish. And the Gemara continues, Umoder Rabbi Akiva. Now Rabbi Akiva would admit, Ba'olas nekeva, let's say you have an ola, an animal ola that is female, and really an animal ola has to be male. So over there, one might have argued that since there's such a thing as an olas nekeva by Ophos, and we're bringing the proof from Ophos according to Rabbi Akiva, so maybe by olas nekeva also it stays on the Mizbeach. But that's not true. Rabbi Akiva would admit, that's similar to the mum, the blemish coming before it's consecrated, and so therefore, in that situation, it would come down from the Mizbeach. And Rashi explains, Ho'aluk she'en ba'ofos, since that kind of a blemish is kosher when it comes to birds, so therefore by the animal, if it has that kind of a blemish, it stays on the Mizbeach. Dechsiv, because it's written, Tamim zochar ba'bokar ba'ksavim, tamus v'zachrus ba'behema, ve'in tamus v'zachrus ba'ofos. It says tamim, that it can't have a blemish. It says that by animals, so we understand that's only by animals, and that is not true when it comes to ophos, when it comes to birds. Umiyu, nevertheless, mechusar aver, let's say it's missing a limb, lo, so that would not be good by a bird, mishum hakriveu nolafechasecha, because of the pasuk which says, would you offer that to your governors? V'chein mum meguna, and the same would be true by a kind of mum that makes the animal meguna, that makes the animal disgraceful. And Rashi continues, V'husha kadam hekdeshan es muman, this is only true if it was consecrated before the blemish. Shachola alein kedushas mizbeach, then the kedusha of the mizbeach was chal, it took effect on the animal kodam earlier than the blemish. Aval kadam muman lahekdeshan, but if the blemish came first, before it was consecrated, lo hayu kodshim mizbeach memein, so then it was never considered kodshim mizbeach, ve'ein ha-mizbeach mekadshon, and the mizbeach does not sanctify them. Umod Rabbi Akiva ba'olas nekeva, Rabbi Akiva would admit by a female ola, an animal that's a female by an ola, also the mizbeach teire, there, such an animal that goes up on the mizbeach should come down. V'afal pi shekshera ba'ofos, and even though that also is kosher by birds, but that's different. The cheman dekada mumah lehekdesh adamya, that's already similar to the blemish preceding the hekdesh. The ein lach mum gadol mizeh, there is no greater blemish than that. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, Yesh nirba ba'ofos, is there a concept of nirba, which means that the bird would be an object of bestiality? If you had a bird that was an object of bestiality, would that disqualify it from the Mizbeach? Oh, ein nirba ba'ofos, so maybe there's no concept of a bird being an object of bestiality. Now by roveya, for it being active in bestiality, that certainly does not apply to a bird. The question just here is nirba, which is physically possible, that it would be the object of bestiality. That's the question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. And the Gemara continues and explains the question, Mi Omar, do we say, Min ha-behema, the pasuk says, you bring a carbon min ha-behema from the animal, lahotzi asarovea v'hanirba, that excludes an animal that engages in bestiality or an animal that is the object of bestiality. Those are not good for karbonos. And we would argue as follows, Kol heicha di'isa b'roveya, if it's an animal which is able to engage in bestiality, and that's true by animals, so isa b'nirba, so then we say there's a disqualification if it's the object of bestiality. And and if roveya is impossible, it does not engage actively in bestiality like by a bird. So let's say benirba, so then we would say there is no disqualification being the object of bestiality by a bird. Odilmor maybe, hare nevda bo avera, we say the bird in avera was done by nirba, and therefore it is disqualified. And Rashi explains, Oflo shaykh be roveya, by a bird it cannot actively engage in bestiality. Dein of roveya isha, a male bird is not going to engage in bestiality with a female, and so therefore roveya is impossible. Nirba is at least technically possible. A bird could be the object of bestiality, but again the question is whether that law applies. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabba says, Tashma, come and hear the following proof from our Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva machshir bebali mumin. Rabbi Akiva, again, he said by an animal that's a bal mum, once it goes on the Mizbeach, it stays on the Mizbeach. And that argument was based on Ofo, since that blemish, Dukin Shaba'ayin, those kind of blemishes don't apply to Ofo. So therefore, by animals, they stay on the Mizbeach. Now, V'imisa, now if it's true that there is no nirba by Ofos, so nachshir nami benirba, we should say that an animal that's a nirba, an animal that is an object of bestiality, also should stay on the Mizbeach, hoil v'kosher ba'ofos, because we should make the same argument. If it's kosher by a bird, therefore, again, we're going to say by animals, that it stays on the Mizbeach. And so the Gemara says, Shma mina, indeed, you see from here that by Ofos, a nirba is not kosher, and that's why Rabbi Akiva does not make that argument. He doesn't say that by nirba, an animal would stay on the Mizbeach. And Rashi explains, V'misa da'of shenirba kosher, if it's true that an oaf that was the object of bestiality is kosher for the Mizbeach, li kosher Rabbi Akiva nami bebehema nirbas. Rabbi Akiva should also say, if an animal was the object of bestiality, im also lo teir, if it goes up on the Mizbeach, it shouldn't come down. Hoel v'kosher ba'ofos lechatchila, since it's kosher by birds, lechatchila. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Afanon nami tanina. We learned like this in a brisa as well. It says, Hanirba v'hamuksa v'hanevad v'esnanu mechir v'tumtum v'androgonus. All of these various kinds of birds, and nirba here is an object of bestiality. Muksa, it's designated for avodah zarah. Nevad, it's worshipped as avodah zarah. Esnan is its used as payment for a zona. Mechir, exchanged for a dog. Tumtum and androgonus refer to a bird which is either can't identify male or female, or it has both in terms of male and female. But kulon mitamin begadim abeis habli. In all of these cases, we say that the bird is mitame begadim, the person's clothing become tame abeis habliya if the bird is swallowed, if it enters the throat. And the point over here is these are all disqualifications from the bird being a carbon, and therefore if malika is done, it's considered to be a nevela. That's the point of the brisa, and therefore you see that nirba by a bird is in fact disqualified from being a carbon, and the Gemara says shma mina. Indeed, we see that this is the case. And Rashi explains, we don't have roveya actively engaged in bestiality, because we're talking about a bird over here in the brisa. There is no roveya by an oaf, as we said, but it does say there's a disqualification of nirba. And then we have tumtum and androgonus in the list in the brisa. Now, even though there's no requirement of male by birds, Kasavar birya b'fnei atzmahi, but the brisa holds this is like a different creation altogether by tumtum and androgonus. Ve'eno safek zachar safek nekeva. It's not a doubt if it's a male or female. It's its own birya. Rabbi Eliezer poligalebe b'choros. Rabbi Eliezer argues on this in b'choros. The Katani Seifa says at the end, Rabbi Eliezer Omer kol makom shenemar zachar nekeva. If it says zachar nekeva, atamotzi tumtum v'androgonus mi beinehem, then you do exclude tumtum and androgonus. But va'of by birds, hoel v'lo nemar bo zachar nekeva, since it doesn't say Zachar and Nekeva. So therefore you do not exclude Tumtum and Androgonus. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim said that his father would reject animals that are blemished from the Mizbeach. He would take them down from the Mizbeach, and that's the same as the earlier Tan in the Mishnah said. And so the Gemara asks, My Kamashmalan, what exactly is he teaching us? Rashi says, My Kamashmalan Tanakama Nami Yordu Kamar. The Tanakama also said that they come down from the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, if you want, I could say Maisa Kamashmalan. He's just telling us an actual incident that happened this way. If you want, we could say Mai Doche. What does it mean? He rejected them from the Mizbeach. Kilachar Yad. He did that in a backhanded manner. Rashi explains Kilachar Yad. Ve'in moridon and derech bizoyon befaresya. He didn't take them down in the open, which would be a bizoyon, which would be disgraceful. That's what it means. He did it in a backhanded manner. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Keshem Shem Allah, in a situation, let's say, where if it goes up on the Mizbeach, so then it doesn't come down, so then also if it comes down, it does not go back up. And the Gemara says, Amar Ula says, Lo shanu elo shelo mashla behen ha'or. That's only true if the fire didn't take hold of it on the Mizbeach. Aval mashla behen ha'or, but once the fire took hold of it, yalu, so then it does go back up on the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, mashla behen ha'or koldehu. If even a little bit the fire took hold, yalu, then already they go back up on the Mizbeach. The nasu lachmo shalesh. At that point in time, they have become the bread of the fire, so to speak, and they would actually go back up on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Rav Mori Masni Aresha. Rav Mori learned this on the beginning of the Mishnah, again talking about a situation where if it normally, we would say, if it came down from the Mizbeach, it wouldn't go back up, but Moshla Behenor, it would go back up. Rav Chanina Misura Masni Asefer. Rav Chanina from Surah, he learned it on the end of the Mishnah, the next Mishnah, Hoatzamos V'Hagidin, the bones and the tendons, these are things that are not normally burned, V'Hakarnayim, V'Atzlafayim, and the horns and the hooves, Bizman Shemechuborin, if they are attached, Yalu, then they go up on the Mizbeach. But Pershu, if they already separate from the meat, so then Lo Yalu, so then they don't go up on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ula says, Lo Shanu, Ela Shelo Moshla Ben Or, that statement that we had is going on this. This is only true if the fire didn't already take hold. Avol Moshla Ben Or, but if the fire did take hold, Yalu, then they do go back up on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues and explains, Man Damasni Asef, if you learn this statement of Ula on the end of the Mishnah, Kol Shekain Aresha, then it is certainly true in the beginning of the Mishnah that if the fire takes hold, it goes back on the Mizbeach. Uman Damasni Aresha, but if you learn it on the beginning of the Mishnah where it's talking about things that are normally burned on the Mizbeach, and that goes back on the Mizbeach if the fire took hold of it. Avol Aseifa, we would not say that though on the end case of the Mishnah when we're talking about things that are not, because Lav B'nei Haktar Ninu, those are parts of the animal that are not normally burned, and therefore we wouldn't say that just because the fire took hold that it should go back up on the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, Aresha Masni La Lahada Ula Aresha Keda Amran. Again, the one way to learn is to learn on the beginning of the Mishnah, like we said. Apsulin Sha'alu V'Yardu, talking about a situation of disqualified items that went up and they came down. Tikatani Masnis and Lo Yalu, where the Mishnah says that they should not go back up. And Pershu Shecholtzu Min Habasar Lefnei Halasan, let's say they separated from the meat. Again, these parts that are not supposed to be burned separated before they went up, Lo Yalu, then they shouldn't go up. V'hu Adinami Demalu Yerdu, and the same is true if they do go up, they should be brought down. Kidamar Lekaman, but Brisa, like we'll say later in the Brisa, Ali B'Derebi, according to Rebbe, Mukminan Masnisin, Ali Bey, we say the Mishnah is like him. And so then the Gemara said, Kol Shekain Aresha, certainly by the Resha it should go back up. The Dam Ola O Emurim B'nei Haktar Ninu, because the blood of the Ola, or the sacrificial portions, that's supposed to be burned. Imlo Nifslu if it wasn't disqualified. V'hani Kevan Demoshla Ben Or, and so over here, since the fire took hold, Kachinu, it sanctifies it. Kama Shem Psulin, as they are. But when it comes to the bones and the tendons that shouldn't be burned, we learn from the pasuk again what goes up, what is supposed to be burned on the mizbeach. Therefore, we don't say that if the fire took hold that it is going to be sanctified. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ve'elu im olu yerdu, the following, if they go up on the mizbeach, they are brought down from the mizbeach. These are items that are not shayach, they're not relevant to be burned on the mizbeach at all. Rashi explains, Ve'elu im olu yerdu v'afal pi sheksher, and even though they're kosher, there's nothing disqualified about what is in this list. The lo shayach bu mizbeach klal, but they're not relevant to the mizbeach at all, and they are the following: Besar kotchei kodshim u'vesar kotshim kalim, the meat of kotchei kodshim and the meat of kotshim kalim. These are supposed to be eaten by the kohanim; they're not supposed to be burned. Umosar ha'omer, and then the remainder of the omer, meaning after the kometz was burned on the mizbeach. This is the part of the omer that is not. Ushtei halechem, and the shtei halechem that's brought on Shavuos. V'lechem haponim, the lechem haponim is the weekly bread. Ushiyore menachos, and the remainder of the menachos, again after the kometz is burned. V'haketores, and the incense. And Rashi explains for ketores, v'haketores sha'olsa mizbeach achitzon. This is the incense that it's supposed to be brought on the inner mizbeach, instead it was put on the outer mizbeach. To halav roihu, that's not fit for the outer mizbeach. And the Mishnah continues, Hatsemer shebarashe kevasim. Let's say the wool on the head of the sheep, Usar shebezakin tiyoshim, or the hair that's by the beard of the goat, V'hatzamos v'hagidim v'hakarnayim v'hatzalafayim, and the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves, Bizman shehem mechubarim, when they are attached to the meat. So then yalu, this is talking about a karbonola. So if it's attached to the meat which is supposed to be burned, then it also goes up on the mizbeach and it is burned. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, that everything is burned. But perishu, but when they separate from the meat, so then lo yalu, then they don't go up on the mizbeach. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, v'yasisa olosecha habasar v'adam, the ola is the meat and the blood. These are really not fundamentally supposed to be going on the mizbeach. And Rashi explains, Hatzemer shebrasha hakvasim, the wool on the head of the sheep. Reisha de baba achrisi, this is the beginning of a new statement in the Mishnah. Uvahade atzamos v'gidin katanila, this is part of the statement of the Mishnah about the bones and the tendons. Uchemishpatan shebrasha kivse shalola sharosh eino bechlal hefshit, the rosh, the head is not part of, flay it. V'karev im oro, it's brought together with the hide. Kidamar v'shchitas chulin perek beis, we say that in shchitas chulin in the second perek. Ein li ela nisachim sheyeshnan bechlal hafshata, v'yeshnan bechlal haktora, I only know that which is cut up, which is flayed, which is burned. Minayin l'rabo says harosh, how do we know to include the head? Shekvar hutas b'shchita, was already slaughtered. Sha'ava pi she'eno b'hafshata, even though it's not flayed, yeshno v'haktora, it is burned. Talmud lomar, the pasuk says, v'yesh tzemer begova orpo eitzel rosho, and there is tzemer over there, near by the area of the back of the neck, by the head. V'chein sar shebezakin tiyashamol, and also the hair that is on the beard of the goats. Again, in all of these situations, if it's attached to the meat, so then it does go on the Mizbeach. Otherwise, it does not go on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Victor HaKohen Esakol HaMizbecha, it says everything is burned, the L'Rabos, V'atzamos, V'agidim, V'akarnayim, V'atzalafayim, that includes the bones and the tendons and the horns and the hooves. Yachol Afilu Pershu, one might say, even if it's separated, it should go on the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomar, V'yasiso L'secha, Basar V'adam, it says the meat and the blood. I Basar V'adam, if just the meat and the blood, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph.